Hello, good to see you. Hi.
Hi.
So today we'll be talking, it's our fifth session, believe it or not. It's our fifth session, and we'll be talking about clinical supervision and how not to forget about clinical supervision in the situation of lockdown and pandemic. As you know, probably, if it would be actually, I've forgotten to ask you, as always, to write in the chat box who you are, where you're coming from, how did you hear about us, and why you're particularly interested in the topic of supervision. I know that quite a few of you have been to SDS seminars, clinical supervision course, essential supervision skills. If you have attended that in the past, can you please mention it as well in the chat, just so that we know how many of you have already done that. And I'll just give you a little more information about it in a minute. And for now, just give you a few more minutes to write down the information about yourselves and where you're from. Last week, we had a very interesting event. We had Professor Wendy Dryden, who did a presentation for us on single session therapy. And this is just a word cloud which I've created on the basis of people who attended our last Zoom session. It was truly international. We had over 400 participants. The biggest crowd was from London, of course, but we had a lot of people from India, Sri Lanka, from Serbia. We had people from USA, Argentina, Canada, and from all over the UK. We had people also from Ireland. We had people from Manchester, from Cornwall, from all over the place, and it was absolutely lovely. And we are quite surprised how much we enjoy having these weekly meetings with you, and just feeling that feedback coming from you. So today we're talking about clinical supervision. And as you probably know, SDS Seminars has a BPS approved certificate in clinical supervision. And this certificate actually meets the training standards required for chartered psychologists to confer eligibility to the British Psychological Society's Register of Applied Psychology Practice Supervisors. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I need to breathe after this. So it's a very, very popular course. I've been counting how many people have completed this certificate, and it's over 3,000 people have completed this certificate with us. So, and it's one of the very few courses in the country which actually enables you to register in this BPS register, and it's a short course, unlike many others which are long courses. So the course consists of several modules, and I'm sure Paul will mention something, but I know quite a few people attended this course with us and finished it yesterday. I wonder if they are here. If you are here, again, just mention in the chat box. It would be really, really nice to see that you are here and actually can see each other and say hello to each other and say hello to Paul. So for now, I think it's probably enough of me talking, and I'm very, very happy to pass the microphone to Professor Paul Grantham and let him share his wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Thank you. And welcome this evening, folks. Just looking at that word cloud that related to Wendy's talk last week, it looks like he drew almost as many people from Bolton as he did from Serbia. I don't know whether we're going to have a similar pattern today, but wherever people are at the moment, I hope you're going to find this useful and practical, and provide some stimulation for thought, really. So to say a couple of things about why we've got this particular issue this evening. Obviously, for a number of you, you'll know that I have a long-standing interest in the field, but I wanted to particularly raise this issue of clinical supervision within the context of COVID-19, because I think that there are some particular issues which both supervisors and supervisees really need to keep an eye on with regards to clinical supervision within the current context. Some of these issues are actually quite novel because of the nature of the experience we're having at the moment, and to my knowledge have not really been addressed before. They to some extent as well may shift some of the priorities that are around for you currently within supervision, but I'll leave that to you really to decide. It's really to raise these issues and to get you to have a think about it. So let's just kick off first of all by saying, you know, why do I think this is particularly important to look at the moment? One of the things that happens during emergencies and when individuals basically start finding themselves in a crisis situation is that certain things come to the fore, not surprisingly, but also certain things have a tendency to go onto the back burner. And I actually think that one of the major problems or dangers that's around with clinical supervision in the current context is that for a lot of people, there is a danger that this will go onto the back burner. Now, as I say, I think this is partly because of the urgency of other priorities. And as many of you will know who have certainly done training with me before, the literature in this field is a bit thin on the ground in the first place, and organizational, I think, particularly commitment to it is extraordinarily variable. So when backs feel like they're up against the wall, then really at the end of the day, there's a tendency for this particular process to have a tendency to slip off, really. And I really wanted to sort of try and put it back center stage for a variety of reasons, which we'll come on to in a minute. Secondly, not surprisingly, the pandemic has had an impact on practitioners' client contact. So what I'm about to say doesn't have any hard data behind it. It's purely based on my impression, both from supervisees and also from supervisors that I supervise in their supervision. But certainly quite a sizable proportion of clients, and particularly supervisees who maybe are in training or maybe working privately, those would be the two groups that would immediately come to mind, are finding that they're losing clients. And particularly if their caseloads are not particularly large in the first place, there's a whole issue that sort of gets raised really, which is, you know, maybe I ought to be putting supervision on the back burner because basically I haven't got that many clients at the moment. I don't want to get too lost in the whole issue of professional body requirements in the current context for supervision, but there are a couple of statements that are around. I mean, I would obviously encourage you to go and see what your own professional body, or alternatively, if you are not in a professional body but you are subject to an organizational policy, to go back and have a look at what that says. But I've already noticed that from some professional bodies, this situation is extraordinarily variable. So the BABCP, for example, basically is stating that there needs to be at least 2 what are termed clinical contacts per week in order for people to basically remain accredited. The BACP has a much looser attitude towards this. They basically state that it is quite possible to take a break from seeing clients as long as that's actually documented. And as far as I can see, the BPS policy statement on this, which has largely been shaped by the Division of Clinical Psychology, has really got no statement at all that I can see about maintaining frequency, really. But as you can see, that's got some quite different implications for people. So why I mention this is, quite simply, there are some supervisees who are basically saying, I'm not really seeing that many people at the moment. I'm losing clients, which we'll come back to in a minute. And for that particular reason, I'm just going to put supervision on the back burner. And I think this is a mistake, which we'll come on to in a minute. Thirdly, and I think this in many ways is as much a challenge for supervisors as it is for supervisees. Issues around working with clients have thrown up some unique and novel challenges. Now, I'm not going to get too drawn in to how these vary according to the problems that people are working with. We're actually, I think, going to have a separate webcast, in fact, on that, I think next month. But the reason why I mention it is that, as you can imagine, if you're working with somebody, for example, who is agoraphobic, or you're working with somebody with health anxieties, or unexplained medical symptoms, or is, you can imagine, or is socially anxious, or has OCD problems, you can see how the current situation throws up some real issues for people. In many ways, the pandemic becomes a validating experience for the client's beliefs. If I have an OCD problem and I have very strong beliefs about contamination, not surprisingly, the current situation appears to provide very strong evidence for that. And I think that there is a tendency, when it's combined with practitioners' own anxieties about the pandemic, there is a tendency, or a danger at least, for practitioners to potentially end up validating or colluding with even clients' beliefs about risk, and maybe projecting some of their own anxieties onto their clients. And I think that's a real issue, but I also think that there's a real challenge there for many supervisors when a supervisee comes along and says, what do I do with my OCD client who has got a great fear of contamination and illness, and suddenly finds themselves in an environment where the whole of the country supports them on this. So those are quite new challenges, and they're new challenges for supervisors and for supervisees. So I just wanted to pick up, to move on from that, looking at one issue, first of all, which is about handling client non-engagement, or its sort of younger brother, really, which is poor client motivation. Why is it that the client doesn't particularly want to engage in therapy at this particular time, or is showing a reluctance to engage with the practitioner? I know that this might sound like a self-evident question to ask, but I'm still quite shocked at how infrequently it seems to get explored with clients at this point, which is to simply ask them why. I mention it because in my understanding and limited experience of what I've seen with this, the biggest obstacle that's actually around for clients is an aversion to alternative methods of communication apart from face-to-face therapy. And we're going to come on to that in a minute, because there are other options in terms of telephone, online, email, and of course, video therapy as well. And I just think it's useful to explore the rationale behind this. We are not going to go into detail today about distance methods of therapy, but I would say that I think that some client anxieties which create poor engagement are dealable with by a therapist if they're given proper guidance and support by their supervisor. The other thing I just want to really sort of say about working directly with clients, which is important, I think, for both supervisees and supervisors to be aware of, is the fact that continuation of therapy, I think, actually has a priority. particularly in this situation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the theory of set point, but set point is certainly something which I guess a number of you will be familiar with if you've ever been in a situation like me of trying to grapple with losing weight, which is that there is a tendency to gravitate or to be pulled back to a set point if you are not still moving forward. So you can understand what I'm talking about here with regards to weight reduction, but the same applies to therapy. If clients are not continuing to move out of their comfort zone, they are looking at basically just standing still, there is an enormous danger that people don't stand still, in fact, but they actually go backwards and they lose a lot of the therapeutic gains which they've already made, and which incidentally they may have gained in quite a painful way, and which it would be a great shame for them to have to recapture again unnecessarily. So even if you can't move forward in this situation, having some degree of momentum, I think, is important, because in that particular way, you may at least be able to hold your ground. And so I think that again, supervisors have a role here about giving this message to supervisees. And I think supervisees need to be raising with their supervisor how in practice they actually do this. The final thing I just wanted to say about client engagement, which I think is important to be picking up in supervision, again, whether it's by supervisor or supervisee, is the need to adjust therapeutic goals. I actually said something briefly about this, I think, on one of my previous Zoom sessions, and how Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and particularly lower level needs, are likely to become much more center stage during the pandemic. But obviously, if I'm concerned about ill health, if I'm concerned about food, if I'm concerned about liquids, freedom from pain, all of those sorts of things, which are more likely to be center stage at this particular point in time for people, a lot of higher level personal needs, which are often being addressed in therapy, are just not going to have the same importance attached to them. So that has some implications for adjusting therapeutic goals. As I said, if you're interested in that, have a look at the previous Zoom session that I actually did on it, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity of opening up your ideas on that. So let's come back to the whole question of the supervisor and supervisee's relationship in the current situation. And this immediately throws up, of course, the issue of remote supervision in a way which I know has also occurred, obviously, therapeutically for a lot of people as well. Now, I don't think in practice the issues are typically as great when we're looking at remote supervision as we are with looking at remote therapy. But having said that, there are still issues to have a look at. So the first one, of course, is what method you're actually going to use. I think that I think it's only available as a recording at the moment, but I do go into this in a lot more detail in the advanced supervision training day that we actually look at. And all I really want to say at this stage is that in most instances, some form of video supervision is far superior to particularly telephone and also to texting. There are certain reasons why there are particular problems with telephone and texting supervision, and why I would lay a particular emphasis on the use of some form of video. The other option is email supervision, and again, I don't want to get too drawn into this, but I do think that email supervision is particularly useful in encouraging more reflection, typically in the supervisee. I think largely because of the space it actually provides people with. But I think at the end of the day, center stage here is going to be the use of video supervision. Now, there's a whole range of issues that have cropped up with this, of which top of the list for most people has been the issue of security. And I'm certainly aware of the fact that a number of issues have been raised in connection with Zoom regarding this, the whole question of whether it's end-to-end encryption or not. I will lay my cards on the table here. I'm a big Zoom fan. And I think that one of the primary reasons why I'm a big Zoom fan is that it is both very stable, probably more stable than any other system I've actually used. And anyone who's ever been trying to engage in a video conversation with somebody and to find that, you know, it freezes or it cuts out or whatever, will find that that's a much bigger issue than typically the worries that are around with regards to security. And the other thing is that you can establish password security on Zoom, and I think that, combined with its stability, personally, for me, puts it head and shoulders above other methods. But I'm not suggesting it's the only one, and it may well be that a number of you have got a favorite method of use, or you may even find that your professional body has made particularly prescriptive statements about this. I would just add that the NHS Information Governance team has come out with a clear statement that they are very flexible indeed regarding attitude towards methods. And for that particular reason, that if any of you are worried about being sued, I really think it's a non-issue. And the security that the NHS tends to place on this, on the whole, tends to be higher than a range of other environments. The other thing I would just want to say about this, because people get terribly hung up on the question of end-to-end encryption and security with regards to video supervision and video therapy, is, can I just say, there are all sorts of other issues that are around with security. Everything from leaving windows open to not putting files in filing cabinets, which seem somehow or other not to cause the same level of anxiety, and to be honest with you, are frequently forgotten about more. I think the home environment where this is going to occur also needs to be looked at to, you know, whether people actually have a private space where they can conduct this or not, again, is going to come into the mix of what it is that you actually use. I think there's a lot of prep that potentially goes into this as well. I'm not going to say really anything more about the prep, partly because we provide some training on this, and also partly because there is some guidance around from a number of professional bodies. And we will be, by the way, at the end of this particular webcast, we'll be putting together a brief list and putting it on, I think, probably our main website for people to be able to actually access. So let's come back to the content of what's actually occurring within supervision. And for those of you that are familiar with the basic Proctor Model, which started off the training that I've been involved in giving, but for those of you that are not familiar with it, can I just briefly say, consists of 3 interactive functions of supervision. And these interactive functions, in no particular order, are restorative, which is basically about addressing the emotional side of the practitioner, the feeling side of this, the formative supervision, which is developmental elements of supervision. This is about improving my my skill set, my knowledge, my decision-making, my ability to form relationships with clients, and a normative function, which really boils down to the whole question of whether I'm practicing safely. Now, I would always argue that some sort of combination of these 3 functions is fundamental in any supervision relationship. But not surprisingly, during the pandemic, there are some very novel demands that crop up with this. So I just really wanted to go through them and highlight them for you, and to give you some pointers really about what sorts of issues you might be able to be looking out for as both a supervisee and also as a supervisor, really. So on the restorative side, an obvious point to make, certainly for those who are working at the sharp end, maybe those particularly working with frontline services, is the whole issue of compassion fatigue and burnout. Although I've mentioned earlier about people not having maybe enough clients, on the other hand, there's folks who are going to be running on the spot with regards to the work that they're doing, and maybe being confronted with issues and challenges which just totally drain them. So you're going to have a look at that, maybe. And also, please don't leave out the fact that typically at work, there's a natural ability to boundary off much more readily what's occurring at home from what's occurring at work. Those boundaries are going to be a lot looser for practitioners, particularly if they're continuing therapy within a home environment. But even if they're not, you know, their kids are at home, their partners are there all the time. There's all sorts of health worries that might be existing in parents and so on and so forth. And there's going to be a greater tendency, I think, for those to intrude into the work life, really, of the practitioner. Secondly, there's specific issues that crop up under formative supervision. And well, there's a couple of fundamental questions here. The first one, which is very complex and which there's not that much currently being written about, is how therapy should be adapted. We are in a very unusual situation, and therapy does need to be adapted in this context. Now, some of this relates to the stuff I was mentioning in connection with Maslow, and maybe altering therapeutic goals in connection with that. But there's a whole issue around, I think, about how you should treat problems in a different way, or how these problems produce new challenges for practitioners because of lockdown, really, and because of the worries that are around for people. Now, again, I'm not going to be going into detail about this. We are going to be looking at this in the future webinar, but for those of you that are interested in it, to be honest with you, at this point in time, what the BACP has actually offered out is very helpful and supportive, but largely generic advice. BPS has offered out some guidance which is much more concerned with trainees and supervision and competencies and what they might be expected or asked to do, which they're not normally used to doing. If you're interested in this from a CBT perspective, the Oxford Centre for Anxiety Disorders and Trauma is producing an ongoing detailed list of how to adapt therapy for quite specific problems, social anxiety, and PTSD and so forth, and so on and so forth. And we'll put that link at the end, really, for you again, so you can have a look at that if you work in that field. Finally, normative supervision. Is there a greater danger that you as a practitioner may be practicing more unsafely? Why is that? Or why is it a possibility, at least? First of all, it's the unusual circumstances that are around. I've already mentioned some of the dangers that are there regarding covertly affirming clients' unhelpful beliefs, the danger of projecting our own anxieties onto clients, but also the fact that certain novel problems may actually crop up. We are already seeing an increasing number of cases of unexplained medical symptoms, basically a hypochondriacal response to what's actually occurring. And of course, finally, there's a whole issue of practitioner isolation and not having the natural support around for them that they're used to having. I think that this is which of these areas you choose to focus on more, or certainly give more emphasis to than you would normally. I think this is a negotiation issue for supervisors and supervisees. But I hope it gives you some food for thought about the different ways in which you might be thinking about clinical supervision within the current context. And I'm sure that that's thrown up more issues than we have got time to answer at the moment, but it's really over to you folks if you've got any questions or comments or things that you would like to actually make, and I'll hand this over to Julia to just take it from there.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. What I'll do now, as I do every time, I'll unmute you all for a few seconds and then mute you again, but with you being able to unmute yourself. So if you have a question related to this topic and you are happy to ask it on video, please feel free to unmute your microphone and go ahead. So I've unmuted you all, so there'll be a little bit of noise. So I'm muting you again, but I will allow you to unmute yourself, okay? I hope it's all clear. It's probably clear as mud. So do we have somebody who wants to ask a question? If yes, unmute yourself and speak. It's quiet.
No.
Please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
I work for an agency. My name's Lila Sims and I'm from Nottingham. I work for an agency and they've asked me, I normally do assessments for them. And they've asked me to do some telephone assessments, which I haven't done. So obviously I will have to be liaising with my supervisor. But I'm concerned about what happens to a client that I've agreed to go into the agency and have counselling, but at the same time, the assessment was done online.
And your concern is what? The lack of an ability to form a relationship in the same way?
Yes, yes.
And when you say the assessment's done online, how online? By video?
Telephone.
By telephone?
Yes.
I think for me, what sort of agency is it?
It's an agency that deals with adult counselling.
Sorry, adult?
Counselling adults, not children.
Right. Okay. So it's quite broad-based, is it?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So
I can understand the problem and concerns. Let me just make a couple of points about how I would approach it. I think the first thing to say is, by definition, you cannot treat the assessment that you're going to do online by telephone in the same way that you would if you were doing it face to face. To make a really obvious point here, there's no non-verbal communication that's actually occurring. Plus the fact, I think, that almost inevitably we are in a very unusual situation. And I think, although we haven't really said a lot about this today, I think there's a general problem about the fact that you can't treat this as therapy as usual, given the current circumstances. So there's two things that I would highlight, which I would give priority to in my assessment, and which I would use to guide the subsequent counselling work. The first one is that I would go through at least some established risk assessment protocol. There are a number of written ones which will easily translate onto the phone. Can I say the risk assessment is notoriously unreliable, but I think what's important is that you demonstrate, or can demonstrate, you've gone through some process of that risk assessment. So that'd be one thing. Basically, in order to highlight that you've not obviously missed some real priority issues, because risk issues really need to take center stage at the moment. The second thing is that I think that therapeutic goals need to be adjusted to the current circumstances. In other words, if I can just give you a very simple example here, if I have a long-standing problem with agoraphobia that is related to, for example, a past trauma, one would work potentially with that in a radically different way in normal circumstances than one would at the moment. So what would be my therapeutic goals, or what would be the things that I would be asking my client about to guide therapeutic goals in this context? And it would probably be the degree to which that problem interferes with the person's ability to function at the moment. So, if they can't get out to get food, if they have to, I know we're not in this situation at the moment, but if, for example, they have to get, in a number of weeks' time, they have to get their child to school, if there are things which substantially interfere with functioning in as normal a way as one can describe it at the moment, I would have those as my temporary therapeutic goals. So I try and negotiate those. Now, once we get back to whatever the new normal is going to be, and we don't know when that's actually going to be, we can obviously renegotiate those, and we can extend them if necessary, if the client's still interested. But I think that you've got to have some goals at this point in time which you work on, which are just which are lower level goals, basically, because people's priorities are different. So I'm not got a problem with it in principle. What I would simply say is that you can't simply, say it's one for one. That really, telephone, well, we'll just do it on the telephone and that's going to be fine, because that's clearly not going to be viable. Hope that helps anyway.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. Another question.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I've been asked to supervise a therapy line which has been set up by my NHS trust, which is for employees of the trust. So it's an extension of the normal wellbeing service for the trust that I work for. And essentially, all employees have been given this number which they can phone in for psychological first aid. And then if they need more than that, they're being directed to a rapid access counselling, they're calling it. Now, this rapid access counselling is, they've set at 75 minutes. I don't know quite where they've got that number from. So the idea is that there are a number of people manning the phones for psychological first aid. There's then one rapid access counsellor on shift, and then there's a supervisor. So I'm doing both roles. I'm doing the rapid access counselling role, and I'm also doing some supervision. So specifically around the supervision, I'm used to supervising. Sorry, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been qualified 10 years. So I'm used to supervising trainees, other professionals, nurses, and other therapists. But the main issue is that I've always done that with people that I know. So people which I've worked in a team with, or trainees, obviously you develop a relationship over time. Whereas now there's a number of people on this service that I've never met, that I don't know. So I'm supervising their work on this new service, which I'm only just getting to grips with myself. So I'm sort of in the unknown as well. And I guess it's just really a question around, I found it quite challenging you've mentioned risk. Well, one big thing around risk is that you have a knowledge, if you're supervising someone, of someone's capability in more generally, and so you base some of your assessment on what you know of them from previously, whereas in a sense now I'm having to do that quite quickly, make an assessment as to how capable obviously I assume that everyone on this call centre is capable. They're all qualified registered psychologists or counsellors or therapists of some description, but in terms of my role as quality manager around that in supervision, that's probably one of the reasons they want a supervisor there. It's quite interesting to make that assessment quickly, and I guess supporting them in an unknown. So I've had some questions from them that I thought, yeah, I'm struggling with that also, around sort of a bit like what's already been brought up, relationship building in a short one-off session, which is often on the telephone with someone who's not in a therapy. It's kind of quite an interesting, different environment for me to be working in. So yeah, some thoughts, I guess, was all I was interested in.
Right. Okay. Well, let's start off with some good news.
Okay.
These folks that you're going to be supervising are likely to be anxious and uncertain about what to be doing.
Yeah.
So they are more likely to wish to embrace you and the help and the support that you're actually offering.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the issues that often crops up of an external supervisor who is unknown coming in and, in a sense, having to win their spurs with a group of people, I don't think is going to be so much of an issue.
No, I haven't found that.
I think that what I would be tempted to do is for you to sit down, and you should be able to do this given your professional background, is for you to sit down and produce a set of guidelines for people. So you've already mentioned the issue of risk here. I think it would be really useful. I think it'd be useful to have some basic criteria or to expand on criteria about when to refer on, for example, and to bring along cases or to give guidance that people should bring cases where there's a lack of clarity about whether to refer on. So in a sense, I would, you know, I would probably, no, I don't know, would I say this? I mean, I would I'll stick my neck out on this. I actually think that one of the biggest ways that you can address the restorative elements of supervision in this context is actually through a formative and normative role.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think people will feel safer, they will feel less stressed if they've got some clear guidelines and they feel their skill set is being supported and validated and upgraded by you as a supervisor. So, I mean, and a lot of the issues that I've just mentioned, particularly about how do you adapt therapy within the current context, I think those sorts of things would be useful. And that particular issue, by the way, about how do you adapt therapy may well be usefully done on a group basis. So don't assume that, I don't know how you're going to do this, whether it's going to be individual or group, but don't assume it's all got to be individual. There'll be some things, particularly formative supervision things, which are probably better done in a group in this context.
Yes. Yeah, so the trust have set up this sort of web-based platform for the phone line. So you're sort of logged on to this, I think it's 3XX or something odd. I don't know, I've not used it before this instance. Oh, I don't know whether it went.
Somebody shared the screen.
Oh, sorry. I see. Right. And basically, so when the phone rings, it rings on the computer, and then somebody answers that. And then, as supervisor, the main role is to check in with everyone at the beginning of the shift and check in with everyone at the end of the shift, and then offer any specific supervision to the person offering rapid access counselling that's necessary.
Right.
And then we hand over to the supervisor of the next shift to any issues. So we're looking at obviously more general issues that come up. So like, did the technology work? Was the risk issues?
Sure.
And then, you know, so that stuff we've been doing over chat as a group, which actually has worked better than I thought. I thought, God, supervision over text chat, that's weird, but actually it works okay.
Right.
And the more one-to-one is on the telephone. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you've said. Yeah.
Okay, well, best of luck.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. We can take one more question and then we'll have to wrap it up. Do we have one more question? Somebody already with the microphone?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Is that for me, Elizabeth Hart?
It is.
For you.
I hope it can, I don't know if this can be a brief question towards the end, but I'll pose it anyway.
Give it a go.
I have a sense of the answer. I've worked for over 10 years in the field of domestic abuse.
Right.
So I have worked running the Freedom Programme, offering group work and individual support. I've now left that work and I have a private practice. So I left that work for a couple of years for my own reasons, to rebuild and restore after working in that field for so long. I get a lot of requests now for individual counselling for women that are living free of domestic abuse. So I wouldn't personally counsel anyone still in that position. I would refer them to services. And I'm familiar with risk assessment for domestic abuse. Would you consider at all working with, my specialism is working with female survivors of domestic abuse. Would you do anything in that area online? If the woman is, Yeah.
Um,
In the current
yes,
situation.
yes, I would actually, and indeed, there is. Yeah, I feel quite happy with that. And when you say, just so we're clear on this, when you say online, do you mean video counselling?
Oh, nothing less than video, yes.
Right, yeah, I see no problems with that at all. The only thing that, I think I said this right at the beginning of this evening, really, which is that the biggest obstacle I've found with this in practice is people are just a bit technophobic, or some people are a bit technophobic. But, if people aren't like that, if they're used to using things like Skype or whatever, then yeah, I see no problem with it whatsoever.
In terms of my feeling was I tend to offer a free session anyway to do the technical side of things, so that it doesn't interfere with the actual process.
Okay.
So together we do that first of all, see how they feel after that about working that way. But my feeling was, in terms of risk assessment, how would I absolutely know there wasn't a perpetrator in the space?
Well, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
You wouldn't. But can I say, you don't absolutely know in any context.
Yes.
So, and indeed, what I would say is that although, one of the advantages, I think, of potentially seeing people on video is that you have some sense of what their domestic environment is in a way which you wouldn't actually if they came to you in an office. So I don't want to make that center stage, but I can think of a couple of instances where there's been useful additional information that I've managed to get from that, for example, in therapy context, which I wouldn't have got in the same way. Simple things like what's occurring behind, where the person actually is, those sorts of things. So I don't have any problems with it. I mean, as long as the whole thing is treated with the same degree of security as it would be, if you're doing face-to-face stuff, I don't see a problem with it at all.
Okay, that's reassuring. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Best of luck.
Thank you. We'll be wrapping it up. I once again will share screen so you know how to find us, and so you can sign up for our emails at www.skillsdevelopment.co.uk. If that is difficult, you can just drop me a line or drop an email to the office and say, please sign me up for future emails. We put all the information about our sessions and recordings of our sessions. 3 previous sessions are all been recorded and all been shared on Facebook page. It's SDS Seminars Facebook page. Please go and have a look. It's a session with Andrew Beck, session with Wendy Dryden, and another session with Paul on health anxieties. We also invite you to join our Facebook group, Therapist Toolkit Support Resources and Networking. It's growing brilliantly. In the last month, we've got over 800 participants. So please feel free to join. We share everything we find useful, and other people are sharing there as well. And what I believe, Paul, I don't know you wanted to mention or not, I think Paul has a couple of slots available on his own supervision, both for supervision of supervisors. So as a supervisor, if you want to have a supervision session with Paul, and supervision as a practitioner. So for that, again, contact Paul directly on Facebook or write to our office at info@sds-seminars.com. So please.
Should also mention, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, of course, Paul, yeah.
Should also mention that we've actually got the essential clinical supervision skills course running next week, I think, isn't it?
Next week, that's right, yeah. We've had one this week and we've got one next week. So if you have time and want to receive PPS approved certificate in clinical supervision, it's a very good time to join us. So next week we've got 2-day course on clinical supervision. And next week, our Thursday Zoom session is free again. It will be on client motivation. And we already have Zoom sessions planned for the rest of the month. There'll be one very interesting session on compassion fatigue with, is it Lucy Maddox?
Correct. Yeah,
And
Dr. Lucy Maddox
mentioned her, and we invited her. And then there'll be a session from the USA with Dr. Jeff Riggenbach, who will be also doing a big seminar for us. So there's a lot of things we're planning for you. So stay connected, and it's really, really good to know that we are not alone. We are all together here and carrying on doing what we do best. Yeah, helping people. So thank you very much for coming. As always, I'll unmute you so you can say goodbye and go and clap for the NHS, and see you next week, guys. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
The connection was very good. The talk can now still be good. Yeah.
I can hear you.
Bye.
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 Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah, feel free to drop us a line if you have any questions or anything. We are always happy to help and answer. So please feel free.
Bye, folks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.